Hello, my name is Robert Schoenberger, and I'm editor-in-chief of IndustryWeek. And on September 27th, I had the wonderful opportunity to speak to the Austin Regional Manufacturers Association about the future of manufacturing, or at least how things are looking into 2023. I got a great response from the audience at the show, and I thought I'd present it to the wider IndustryWeek audience as soon as I can. So this presentation is looking at three main topics that are affecting everyone in the manufacturing world these days: workforce, supply chain, and the economy. So I'm going to go through this presentation, trying to leave out some of the bits that might have been a little too Texas specific. So I'm going to skip part here talking about how great we are at Industry Week, because hopefully you guys know that already, and we're jump right into the workforce. Anyone with a real eagle eye here who's looking at the image there is going to spot that that's Tesla's new plant in Austin that is just barely operational at this point. Huge facility, one of the largest automotive plants in the world, putting out electric vehicles. So when we talk about workforce these days, one of the big issues we're running into is the lack of it. Here's a chart that everyone's used to seeing, looking at the monthly quits nationwide. At the peaked at some point toward the end of last year at 4.5 million people quitting their jobs every month in this country. Huge increase. And if you look at this, oh my God, nobody wants to work. Look at everyone who's quitting their jobs since the pandemic hiring for, or the pandemic global shutdown of manufacturing ended. Well, are we really seeing that? If you take a look here, where did that Great Resignation start? It didn't really start in the beginning of 2020, as a lot of people when a lot of people were talking about it. It started in 2009 when we started recovering from the Great Recession. The Great Resignation is a slow, gentle increase in the number of people quitting their jobs every month that people only started noticing during COVID, when it went away for 1 month before just springing back into action. If you look at where we are right now at this roughly 4 million people a month quitting their jobs, that's exactly where the trend line was pointing pre-COVID. So this is a long-term demographic shift in how people are working and where they're working. And it's not due strictly to COVID. COVID just exposed something that had been happening for quite a while before that. So what's causing it? Here's a really wonderful counterintuitive slide to look at. When we talk about why are people quitting their jobs so easily, it correlates really, really closely to housing. And the cost of housing. This chart is showing you that quits number that I was showing you earlier compared to the consumer price index as it relates to housing. So this is rents, this is utilities, this is just about everything that goes into owning a home. One big caveat, obviously, causation and correlation. They're not necessarily linked. My mother was a high school math teacher, and she always warned me against causation and correlation. And her great example, and one that's always guaranteed to get people to look down, is that there is a one-to-one correlation between student reading ability and shoe size. Whenever she said that, her students would look at their own feet and say, that can't be true. I have small feet, but I read at a college level. Or, I have huge feet and I'm barely getting by in my English classes. How can you say there's a one-to-one correlation between shoe size and reading ability? And after they finished getting angry or finished yelling about that, she would point out that 3-year-olds have tiny feet and they are very poor readers. So the fact that that reading ability and shoe size correlate to each other really is just a recognition that small children who don't know how to read yet have tiny feet. So that said, I think there is a strong causation when you look at housing and quits. And John Fraze, who's done some webinars with us recently, has pointed out that more than half of young people age 18 to 29 are living with one parent these days. And if you are living with a parent and your boss comes up to you and says, I really need you to work 72 hours straight to make our next deadline, it's a lot easier to say, no, I'm going home and quit that job if you don't have to pay rent that month and you have a roof over your head and you have food in the refrigerator. This is not to criticize this younger generation. It's we have made housing so expensive in so many places in this country that they can't afford to live independently, and that inability to live independently creates a massive amount of mobility. So if you have to live with your parents, you also have the freedom to say no to really bad job assignments instead of putting up with things that previous generations were willing to put up with. So the next data point that people love to talk to when they say people don't want to work these days. By the way, I have another colleague who points out that no one has ever wanted to work. That's why you have to pay them to do it. But that's another argument. But if you look at the force participation rate, the number of people in the economy who are choosing to work, this is 16 and up, just anyone in the who is basically within the age group that's able to work, and how many of them are working. And pre-pandemic, that was hanging out at 63%, and post-pandemic, we're about 61, 62%. So see, we've lost this massive, when you multiply that out by the hundreds of millions of American workers, hundreds of millions of people in the country, clearly we are running into a spot where people don't want to work. Well, as I like to do here, let's pull back the camera a little bit and look at that over a much larger uh, uh, larger time frame. And you see that, gee, people stopped wanting to work not post-pandemic, not recently. They stopped wanting to work in 2000. This is a 22-year trend of gradual decline that the best you can say about it is in the 5 or 6 years leading up to the pandemic, it had flattened out a bit. Then you had the giant decrease, which is the pandemic, when factories were shut down and people couldn't participate in the labor force. And since then, it seems to be climbing up pretty closely to where things had been, to the point of where we are now as to where we were almost exactly 62.4% labor participation. We're almost exactly to where we were about 6 years ago. So we're actually right about where we were historically. And if you look at the really long-term trend going all the way back to the 40s, you see that we had a huge upswing in labor force participation when women entered the workforce, and then it peaked, and we had this really nice plateau from the early 90s into it was roughly around 2000, around the Great Recession, where we're sitting at the 67% labor market participation. These were the peak earning years of the boomers. This was a huge generation that was sitting over that great the workforce, and they were very highly employed. And as they have moved towards retirement, labor force participation has moved down to the 62% range. I think to also be really clear about here is when we're talking, these are very close numbers, 62%, 64%. We're really not talking a huge range with this evidence that nobody wants to work. We're getting pretty close to where we had been pre-pandemic, and yeah, we'll know within a year or two if this is just a permanent change with the number of people reduced, or if this is something shorter term. The trend lines point to something much, much longer term, though, that it's not being just an impact of the past couple of years. So looking specifically at manufacturing, I think this is a chart that a lot of people remember seeing and have seen many, many times. It's manufacturing output compared to manufacturing employment. Because if you look early on, this goes back to 1938. In those early days, every time you wanted to make more stuff, you had to hire more people to do it. And until you look at that orange line, that is the manufacturing output. Sometime there, and it was really started in the 70s, but really peaked in the 90s. Uh, the output kept going up, and the number of people employed started going down, and started going down pretty fast in a couple places. So you decoupled manufacturing, actually making stuff, from the number of people who you needed to make that stuff. And let's hone in on a really critical decade here, 1997 to 2007. And that blue line there, that's the jobs number. You see that really drop very sharply and continue to decline. At the same time, that orange line, the output, continues to move up and up and up and up. This is automation, and this is also very much outsourcing. We're going to take all of our low skill, low value components and materials, and we're going to ship those to Mexico, or we're going to ship them to Central America, or we're going to ship them to Asia. And we're just going to buy those components and integrate them or assemble them into a finished product here in the US. So when you take away all of the low value stuff and just leave the high value stuff, the value of total output increases. the value, or the number of workers needed to make that decreases pretty sharply. And you have this very troubling decoupling of manufacturing output and manufacturing employment. But I noticed I stopped at 2007, and let's take a look at the past decade. Really, since the Great Recession, leading into the Great Recession, and since then, manufacturing output and manufacturing employment have been very, very closely aligned. We're no longer seeing a situation where where increased automation, better manufacturing execution systems, better manufacturing practices are completely erasing the need to have workers. Instead, we have a market where you want to make more stuff, you need to hire more people. And that became very, very apparent during COVID. You had a complete shutdown of employment and output. And since then, manufacturing employment has just really moved up. We are above pre COVID levels. We are getting very close to pre Great Recession levels. At the current growth trends we're seeing, we could be up at the pre Great Recession levels of 2008 within the next 6 to 12 months. The New York Times recently took a look at this. They declared that this is the hottest job market in manufacturing since the 1970s. I think they really missed the mark by calling this a short-term trend. They were looking at a lot of the things that have happened post-COVID, such as reshoring, such as the need to replenish certain supplies, and some of the shifts in what's being manufactured. I think the data really strongly point to the increase in manufacturing employment well predated COVID. This goes back to the Obama years through the Trump years and into the Biden years. This has been a pretty nice trend, interrupted only by COVID. But even then, you see that we are now to the point in our economy that you have to hire people to make stuff. And this creates a really interesting question for manufacturers. It's you're going to have to spend one way or the other. You're either going to have to spend to attract the employees to make more stuff, or you're going to have to spend a lot more on automation to find that technological solution. You're going to have to go back to that 1997 to 2007 massive, massive increase in manufacturing technology spending, and you can do that. That works. That's not cheap. But then again, neither is paying sign-on bonuses and wage increases, because you're to compete for workers with trucking, with Starbucks, with Amazon, and every other industry that desperately needs people right now. So now that I've maybe really given everyone something wonderful and cheerful to think about, let's move on to supply chain. Where are we standing with supply chain these days? This is the Global Supply Chain Pressure Index. This is calculated by the Federal Reserve Bank. I believe this is from New York. I have some statistics here from the Federal Reserve of St. Louis and some from the Federal Reserve of New York. The Supply Chain Pressure Index is from New York. The thing to really note here, this is looking at the cost of shipping. This is looking at the cost of raw materials. The thing to look at is really look to the left, pre-COVID, how stable this was. Yeah, there were definitely periods of shock where they went up, they went down, but they stayed within a fairly tight range. And then we get, even if you look at the 1970s, the kind of middle of the chart, that's the global oil shock of the 70s. That was the OPEC embargo. My goodness, how can we possibly handle all this inflation? And then you look at what's happened in the past few years. This is not. This goes back to 2019. This massive increase, then a massive decrease, and then another massive increase. The volatility has been unlike anything we've ever seen before in this country, and the peaks have been much higher than anyone has ever expected. So this is leading to inflation, but this is the great roiling of the supply chain that we've all been experiencing for the past couple of years. If we just look at those past 2 years, you see the peak in December of 2020, and then the fairly nice drop off since then with some ups and downs. Things look like they're stabilizing, but they're stabilizing at a very high level. Again, when that if you look to going back a little bit, these numbers that kind of move between -1 and +1 over most of the history, going back to the 1980s. And all of a sudden, this massive up and down rate recently, we're talking the 3.5 to 5 increases. So just a massive amount of volatility at a very, very high level. So Something near and dear to my heart, auto production. I spent 20 years writing about the auto industry, and I think auto is a really good stand-in for what's going on in supply chain. And this is auto production over the past couple of years. You see the big decline. Obviously, COVID obviously had to shut down the plants. But the thing is that we stopped all automotive production, and then we resumed all automotive production very, very quickly. You go from this was April. By June, we're just back to right where we were, like nothing had happened. And that's when we started running out of computer chips, and production kept falling and falling and falling. This is the time when people absolutely wanted to buy cars, when people were signing up for weeks and weeks and weeks waiting for their cars. We got to the point where we were had halved production from where we'd been at the pre-pandemic levels, not because we couldn't get people into factories, not because people were sick and dying, but because we just didn't have components for them. Things have improved somewhat over the past few months. We're now at that kind of 150,000 a month range of vehicles. Again, but that's down from somewhere around 220,000 a month pre-COVID. So we're still nowhere back to the production levels we were at earlier in the pandemic. I mean, you can talk about there was a 60% decline from that peak of production down to the worst valley of production about end of last year. And since then, things have actually improved quite nicely. But again, still nowhere close to where we had been pre-recession. So the supply chain in automotive and for many, many other industries remains completely and utterly snarled. The Port of Long Beach still has backups. You still have problems getting shipping containers from Asia to the U.S. You throw into that all of the zero COVID policies in China, where one person getting sick in one apartment building can lead to dozens of factories shutting down in the more populated areas of the country. That makes it very hard to rely to get product out of that country into our country, where it can be put into finished products of one kind or another. So again, nice and cheerful information for you. Things are getting better, but they're nowhere near pre-pandemic levels and nowhere near fixed. So let's move on to the economy. And really, there's only one word we can talk about when we talk economy, and that is inflation. Here's our consumer price index going back to 1947 when we started collecting this, and you'll see like I mentioned earlier, it was very, very flat. Inflation was just minimal in this country from 1947 through the early 1970s. Then that first sharp increase you see is the oil embargo and the fallout from that. And then we had higher general inflation for the next, from the late 70s until 2019. Things were fairly stable. Some years you'd have a big increase, then you'd have a decline. But boy, that was a nice even number for a very long time. You look at that fat middle curve, the fat middle part of the curve here. This was roughly 2.7% annual compound annual growth rate on inflation for a very, very long period of time. Great numbers made it fairly easy to predict where the economy was going, how to predict investments, how to set interest rates. All these things were pretty stable for decades. It's just an amazing period of that. Obviously, that's not where we are now. So let us look at this last little bit, the past 2 years. And you see inflation has gone up very, very rapidly. The only positive thing you can say about inflation so far over the past 2 years is that it has flattened out in the last 2 months. There was no increase from May to June, and then from June to July, it was a fairly minimal increase. Again, we're still very, very high levels of inflation. It just didn't get any worse in the past 2 months compared to the previous 22 months. So I mentioned 2.7% was the average inflation rate going into the 3 decades leading up to the past couple of years. It's been at 5.2% over the past 2 years. I'm sure you've all heard the 9.5, 9.5, 9.6% rates. That is looking just at the year-over-year numbers. I'm looking at the compound growth rate over a 2-year period, so it's a slightly different calculation, but it still gets you to the same place. Very, very high, very steadily high inflation, only slightly tempered in the past couple of months. So where does that leave us? Where are things heading from here? This is a very Texas-centric thing. The capital region where Austin is and where I was making my presentation, they have far outperformed the nation and the rest of the state of Texas in attracting manufacturing jobs. A lot of this is centered at Austin is a huge center of semiconductor manufacturing, so they have definitely benefited from the problems that the rest of the country has had in getting semiconductor chips in. They've also had Tesla move in. It's a massive new facility. They've had a nice increase in military aerospace. So Austin's done quite a nice job building up that manufacturing sector in Central Texas. But when we look at the bigger picture, what's next? This is the reshoring initiative, which looks at foreign direct investment and companies moving jobs back to the US from overseas. And both have had a nice, really appreciable effect in recent years, a massive spike since the pandemic started. If you look at the growth in 2020 and beyond, this is a trend that Harry Mosher from the Reshoring Initiative has talked about a lot. And so we've heard this from Ingersoll Rand. We've heard this from a few machine tool manufacturers that there is a lot of ordering of industrial equipment and a lot of expansion of factories within North America with the goal of building up the U.S. supply chain again. That really we've had supply chain scares in the past. We had the Fukushima earthquake in Japan that made it impossible to buy a black Ford Mustang because the pigment in the black paint came from one factory in Japan. We've had other scares. We've had problems getting materials out of countries because of earthquakes and floods and other sorts of issues. But each one of those crises was short-lived and very specific to a handful of products. COVID was very different in that it was every product, and it was the entire supply chain that was completely disrupted. If parts coming from Asia or Europe, it didn't matter which direction they were coming from, you couldn't get them in a timely manner. The cost of getting them in was much higher than expected. And people realized, I think, in a very large numbers, the vulnerability of the supply chain, which means that we had to rethink how we manage our supply chain. And that's led a lot of companies to either foreign-owned companies are now investing in U.S. production capacity. We're seeing that with Samsung. We're seeing that with Taiwan Semiconductor. We're seeing that with some of the automotive companies really doubling down and expanding their U.S. facilities to provide the product close to where the consumption is taking place. And then you have a lot of U.S. companies that are rethinking their strategy of global manufacturing footprints and seeing some real value in building it a little closer to home. Now, will this trend continue? Are we seeing the death of the global supply chain? I seriously doubt we'll ever see that because there's still too many advantages to producing in low-cost areas and to outsourcing commodity or low value-add products. But I think you're also going to see a lot of people looking to protect themselves against these global disruptions that we've had over the past few years. And this is where my presentation ended. I had some very good questions from the audience. I'm sorry we don't have that recorded. But a very good one I got was, when it comes to what do we do about this, especially the employment question, how do we get more people into factories? Someone asked, where do I see people doing things right? What's a good example of a community that's doing a good job in making manufacturing more attractive in one way or another? And I mentioned Massachusetts. This was Adrian Selko, our editor who covers workforce issues, had a really great story about the vocational education programs in Massachusetts. Really pointed out that they've mainstreamed the topic. Instead of having a college track and a vocational track for students, everyone's in the same classes. Everyone has to take math. Everyone has to take English. but the questions asked in those classes are more manufacturing centric. So the vocational education student is being spoken to when the math teacher asks a question. So an example of this is if you're asking a standard geometry question, you have a 6-inch by 6-inch cube, and you want to have a 3-inch diameter sphere. How much material are you losing? Well, okay, so you calculate the volume of the cube, you calculate the volume of the sphere, and you subtract one from the other. Fine. Instead, that question is being asked something along the lines of you have a 6-inch by 6-inch cube of steel, and you put that into your CNC machine and you program it to cut away until you have a 3-inch radius sphere. How much steel did you have to cut away to do this? So it's the same basic question, but it's putting this in terminology instead of making it a academic question. It turns it into a practical question that a manufacturing student would want to answer. So I found that fascinating. I also mentioned some regional work that the economic development agencies are doing. So they're cooperating instead of competing against each other. We're seeing this in Ohio. I've seen that in Louisville, Kentucky. I've seen that in portions of the South as well. Some of these regional compacts to try to shore up the manufacturing infrastructure, either through educational training, through better road construction, things like this, rather than strictly fighting it out on incentives. Although incentives remain very, very popular in the economic development world. So that's pretty much what I discussed in Texas. Again, it's a shame we didn't have a good recording of this because there was a lively crowd and a very nice response to it. But I thought this would be a great way of at least sharing some of that material with you. So again, Robert Schoenberger on behalf of Industry Week. Have a great day.